Well, good Wednesday afternoon, everyone. Scott Beaulieu, Dean of the College of Business here at North Dakota State University. This is our first event of the spring semester in the Menard Distinguished Speaker Series. We're delighted to have Jason Riley joining us in just a minute. Thank you to everyone who's upstairs in the Louise joining us today. I hope the food is good and that you all are enjoying free copies of Jason's books. Thank you to all of you who are joining online. The format is much like our previous lecture series or presentations, about 40 to 45 minutes of Jason and I having a conversation. Then we will turn it to our audiences, both upstairs and virtual. Those who are fully online and not in the Louise can enter at any time into the Q&A questions. They can be liked or encouraged to be asked, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Up in the Louise, we also have guests who can come up to the stage and ask questions as they see fit. So without any further delay, let me just introduce you all to Jason Riley real briefly. So Jason is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, where he has published opinion pieces for more than 20 years on topics related to politics, economics, education, immigration, social inequality, and race. He is the author of 5 books, including the 2021 biography Maverick, which chronicles the life of public intellectual Thomas Sowell, and where we'll begin today's conversation. His most recent book, published in February 2022, is The Black Boom, an assessment of the shrinking Black-white gaps in joblessness, income poverty, and other measures prior to the pandemic. He's from Buffalo, New York originally. Jason, we wish you could be here with us in really chilly Fargo, North Dakota. We've had 8 blizzards this winter. You know a thing or two about lake effect. I'm learning a thing or two about wind. We've had 8 blizzards, 6 school cancellations, and it's probably about 3 below right now outside, but it's not as windy today. So warm North Dakota, welcome to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes, let's dig right in. Last week we had an event where we showed students the Thomas Sowell documentary, and that's a book that I'm really excited about because Sowell was a major influence on me as an economist. I went to George Mason, studied with Walter Williams, another great Black economist who died just a few years ago, and wondering if you could just walk our viewers through Sowell, why you got interested in this topic, on what his legacy is as an economist and a Black intellectual.
Well, there were a couple reasons I wanted to write the Sowell biography. First one was I was quite surprised that there wasn't one out there already. This is a first-rate scholar, and I was shocked that no one had given him a biographical treatment. I soon learned he wasn't much interested in having a biographer, and maybe that had something to do with it. But that was one of the reasons I wanted to do it. I thought he was someone who deserved to be better known, particularly among a younger generation of people coming along today. So many of his writings continue to be relevant to our current policy debates on everything from minimum wage laws and affirmative action and social justice and slavery reparations and immigration and on and on and on. Sowell has covered these topics, and I thought that he should be better known. And quite frankly, I was disturbed, I guess is the word to use, by the fact that so many people today know names like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones and Cornel West, and Ibram Kendi, but not Tom Sowell. Sowell is someone who, frankly, has written circles around those individuals, maybe around all of them put together, in fact. And it's not just the breadth, or I should say the volume of his writings that is more impressive than the names I just mentioned, but also the rigor and the depth of his thinking is something they don't come close to matching. I think he anticipated a lot of their arguments decades ago and refuted them decades ago, before some of them were even born. And so I thought that this was someone whose intellectual output deserves a biographical treatment. It's an intellectual biography by and large. I do delve into his personal life somewhat, but mainly this is about his ideas, his legacy as an intellectual. And the second reason I wanted to write it is because he had such a profound influence on my own thinking. I discovered Sowell in college in the early 1990s. I worked on the school paper I was sitting around one day talking with some colleagues about affirmative action, and someone said, "Jason, you sound like Tom Sowell." And I said, "Tom who?" And the person wrote down the name of a book on a sheet of paper. I went to the school library that afternoon, checked it out, read it that evening in one sitting, and returned the next day to the school library to check out the rest of its Tom Sowell collection. And I've been hooked ever since. I first got to meet Sowell in the mid 90s after I joined the Wall Street Journal editorial page. By that time, Sowell was based at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, but he would come through New York on book tours and meet with editorial boards. And he's written quite a few books, so he came through New York quite often. And so that's how I first got to meet him in person. And then I later, some years later, went out to Stanford to write a longer profile of him for the journal, and we sort of struck up an acquaintance that has endured. And I was on his case to write this book for a good dozen years before I think I just wore him down in his dotage. He'll be 92 years old in June, so maybe he just said, to get this crazy guy off my back, I might as well let him go ahead and write this book and cooperate. And he finally did.
Yeah, the book is titled Maverick, and it's excellent. So, framing Sowell's legacy, how would you sum it up? I was always impressed with Williams as a price theorist. You know, he understood more microeconomics in like his thumb than most people do who have studied it in depth. And you know, we prepared for our preliminary exams at George Mason with this bank of questions that Williams had created. And they were like real doozies, like true, false, or uncertain, a cockroach is rational. And you knew that every question had to be uncertain. So you're just trying to think like him. Sowell, I always thought, is just a little bit more empirical and maybe skeptical as well. Is that one of the lasting contributions, is just, you know, be careful how you interpret data, particularly about race?
Yes, I think you're right. That will certainly be one of his legacies. And I think describing him as an empiricist is certainly accurate. He comes out of that Chicago school. I think he'll have a couple legacies. One will be, and this is sometimes meant as a derogatory term, but I don't mean it that way. He has been an economic popularizer. He is someone who has felt, like Walter Williams, in fact, that economic literacy is extremely important in a free market democracy. And he has set about making people more economically literate. And his best-selling book is Basic Economics, which is essentially an economics textbook without any graphs or charts in it. He wrote one of those too, but his best-selling book is Basic Economics. And even though he's probably best known for his writings on racial controversies, economic literacy is what he spent a lot of time doing, and not only writing about economics in a way that the average person can understand, but so many other topics: sociology, history, migration, you name it. He's felt it is the job of an intellectual not just to speak to his peers in the academy, but to explain his discipline to people who are not fellow intellectuals. I think that's something he got from some of his mentors at the University of Chicago, namely Milton Friedman, who also, after leaving his teaching post in the 1970s, wrote books for popular general audiences, lectured on college campuses, and among others who were not steeped in the economics discipline. And I think Sowell followed that example. So I think that will also be one of his legacies. I also think he has distinguished himself in a way that really shouldn't distinguish you as an intellectual, but sadly does today. And that Sowell is an honest intellectual. He is someone who follows the facts where they lead. You mentioned his empiricism. Follows the facts where they lead, reports the results, even when they are unpopular. He is someone who has put truth above popularity. He despises sort of faddish thinking that comes and goes. Political correctness is not something he concerns himself with. And, you know, he's paid a price for that attitude. You know, by and large, the political left dominates the academy, dominates the media, dominates the intellectual organizations that hand out the fancy awards to scholars and academics. And Sowell has refused to play footsie with those people over the decades, refused to pull his punches. And I think it's cost him. It's cost him in terms of notoriety. It's one of the reasons he's not as well known as those other individuals I mentioned earlier. But Sowell is not someone who has concerned himself with being popular. He's concerned himself with pursuing the truth, which again is something I think should be commonplace among intellectuals, but sadly today is not.
Yeah, I think we're going to get a little more into this. It's a nice segue to your own work, and not necessarily the most popular work in all circles, but you nonetheless have a number of contributions that I want to dig into that I think are data driven and stand on their own. So I wanted to ask you about your new book, Black Boom, and kind of the core finding in that, but maybe pair it as well with the book that I first stumbled upon and learned about your work as a public intellectual, Please Stop Helping Us. I think that the two have certain common themes in them when you're looking at data on poverty, crime, race, and what long-term trends look like and how we're doing currently.
Sure. Please Stop Helping Us was a book written around the 50th anniversary of the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson. And I wanted to look back at these programs, these government programs that had been put in place by and large to address issues around the Black poor, to help them, to close income gaps and racial gaps and outcomes across all types of measures. And I thought it would be a good time to look back, see what had worked, what had not worked, and why. And I found a lot of the policies wanting. They had not, in fact, met the objective of the people who supported them at the time, whether we were talking about affirmative action policies, minimum wage hikes, welfare state expansions in general, spending on poverty programs and so forth. They had simply not done what proponents said they would do. And I thought maybe we should reevaluate how we were trying to address some of these problems. And so that's what I sort of get into in that book. My newest book, The Black Boom, is an assessment of Black economic advancement prior to the pandemic under the Trump administration. I think it was a very much underreported story. Blacks made tremendous economic gains in the years prior to the pandemic, record low poverty rates, record low unemployment rates. Black wages were rising at a faster rate than white wages between 2017 and 2019. And the press largely ignored this story, and they ignored it because they had decided very early on that Donald Trump was a president who was a bigot and someone whose policies were going to harm the economic prospects of minorities in this country. And when that turned out not to be the case, they simply ignored the story because it undermined that narrative that they had clung to or decided to cling to, notwithstanding the facts on the ground. So I wanted to tell the story of what was going on and why it was going on. And to the extent that it relates to Please Stop Helping Us, what I'm getting at in the book is that free market policies, tax cuts, deregulation, growing the economy in general, does a much better job of closing income gaps, achievement gaps, what have you, than government wealth redistribution policies, which is essentially what the Great Society was all about. Compare one to the other. And that's what I am doing in The Black Boom. And it's not an endorsement of Donald Trump's Twitter feed or personality traits or what have you. It's a defense of free market economic policies and an argument that they do a better job than wealth redistribution and racial preferences when it comes to helping the Black underclass. It's really, The Black Boom, a story of how the working class in this country was doing prior to the pandemic under the Trump administration. It just so happens that Blacks and to some extent Hispanics are overrepresented among the working class in this country. But what I'm describing, the trends I'm describing in the book really apply to the working class, wages rising for people at the lower end at a faster rate than they were for their bosses. And so that's what I'm getting at in that book.
So then take us through COVID and up to the present, if you can. What are the data saying about the last few years? You know, the workforce issues here are tremendous. Everyone's complaining about not having help. Even our Starbucks, if you wanted to do Starbucks in Fargo, has been closed for a few months. Many places are drive-through only. Is it still booming? And then can you tell us a little bit about this inflation bogeyman that is the concern of everyone and what that might mean for the working class?
Well, one of the things that disturbs me about the current administration is them wanting to roll back a lot of the policies that I believe led to the boom we were seeing prior to the pandemic. So raising taxes on corporations and on individuals, expanding the welfare state. And you mentioned unemployment. I mean, we have a labor shortage in this country. To the extent that you're going to expand government handouts, government relief, and disincentivize people to re-enter the workforce, you're only going to exacerbate that labor shortage that we already have. I mean, there are millions more jobs and there are people looking for work in this country. And then on top of that, you have the inflation problem where people see their purchasing power diminished. Their money, their paychecks aren't going as far as they used to. And meanwhile, you have an administration who is looking to fill positions at the Federal Reserve with individuals that it hopes will simply advance a more progressive agenda. People who are concerned about, who want to use Fed policy to address climate change or equity issues in the economy. I mean, the Fed has its hands full right now controlling inflation, you know, raising interest rates to a point where they stop the inflation we currently have and don't cause a recession. That's a full-time job, in my view. And the idea that you would want to people the Federal Reserve with people preoccupied with other issues well outside the mandate of the Federal Reserve, I think is quite troubling. But mainly to the point I was addressing in the Black boom. I mean, let me back up a little bit. People forget how tough things were for Blacks in particular, economically, under Barack Obama. Obviously, Black folks were extremely proud of having a Black president, as was much of the country, and what that symbolized in terms of racial progress in this country. And Obama remained popular in terms of his personality throughout his presidency and to this day. But his policies were much less popular. And if you look at the situation of Blacks under Obama, for example, the Black unemployment rate did not fall below double digits until the 7th year of the Obama presidency. Blacks had it quite difficult under Obama economically. And when Trump comes along, puts in place this tax cuts, puts in place this economic growth agenda, Blacks see their poverty rates fall to record lows. They see their unemployment rates fall to record lows and see their incomes rising at faster rates than whites. And so I'm afraid that to the extent that President Biden wants to reverse a lot of these policies that we saw put in place under Trump, Blacks in particular could see themselves returning to the bad old days of what was going on in their communities economically. And I find that particularly troubling too. Though I do think that if you look at the polls in terms of Black and Hispanic support for Biden, it has fallen quite dramatically over the past year. And so I'm not sure that the Democratic Party won't pay a price for trying to do what the progressives wanted to do in terms of minority support. And I'd also point out that Donald Trump's support among both Blacks and Hispanics went up in 2020. Even though he lost the election, his support among minorities increased. And I think it had to do with how those minority groups were faring under his presidency prior to the pandemic. I think that's a reflection of how those communities were doing, particularly Black men and Hispanic men.
Thank you. So one more book that I think is maybe one of your lesser known books, and then I want to get to contemporary issues related to race in America. I'm a big fan of this one. Actually have done some work myself in the area of immigration and taken a few bullets for it, because if you're in favor of immigration, it's something that not everyone agrees with you on, especially if you write it in popular media. But you have a book titled "Let Them In," and it's a drift away from a lot of your writing, which is focused on race and poverty. And wondering what led you down a book on immigration, and what's your bottom line on that one?
Oh, sure, sure. That was my first book, actually. I believe it's 2008. And it came out of my day job at the time. I was on the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, and immigration was one of my beats, so to speak. It was the topic I wrote about for the newspaper. And that book sort of came out of my following the issue as a journalist. And the Wall Street Journal has long been a supporter of immigration and valued what they bring to the U.S. economy. And it's a principled free market view. I mean, this was a view. A lot of people and a lot of the students out there are probably too young to remember this, but your Ronald Reagan's Republican Party, your George H.W. Bush's and George Bush's Republican Party were much more pro-immigrant than today's mainstream Republican Party is. Even presidential candidates, Republican GOP nominees who went on to lose, like a McCain or a Romney, were much more pro-immigrant than what you saw in someone like Donald Trump. It was the mainstream view of the party. It was not a pro-illegal immigrant argument. It was just a pro-legal immigrant argument. And the thinking was that the best way to address illegal immigration was to give people more legal ways to come to the country. These are mostly economic migrants looking for work. And to the extent that you believe that the free market does a better job of allocating resources, including labor resources, that's the type of system you wanted. You wanted a system that reflected free market principles in terms of determining the level of foreign labor in our country. And so in that book, I sort of make the case for more free market oriented immigration policy in this country, and that's where that came out of.
That's great. So shifting gears a bit to just the state of affairs in America today, wondering if you can just tell us what your perception is of the state of race in America at the moment. Are things worse than ever, better than ever, somewhere in between? Minneapolis is just 3.5 hours down the road. It still is just a town that's unrecognizable to me compared to what it was even 5 years ago before some of the George Floyd activities. Where are we as a country in dealing with race? And are you optimistic or just kind of neutral on how things are?
Right now, I'm pretty pessimistic, frankly. I wouldn't go so far as to use superlatives like worst ever, but I think we're moving in the wrong direction and might continue in the wrong direction before things get turned around. I think the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is ascendant right now. And so long as that is the case, I think we're going to be moving in the wrong direction on a lot of these topics, particularly surrounding crime and surrounding education. And that's what I find troubling. I think the prominence of the Black Lives Matter movement in discussions around race and inequality in this country is a very troubling development. I think the critical race theory, the rise of that thinking, something that used to be relegated to college seminars, now creeping into diversity seminar or diversity discussions in the workplace, workshops, and so forth, and then into K through 12 education in the form of things like the New York Times 1619 Project. I find all of these developments very, very disturbing, particularly on the what's going on educationally with the K through 12 and the 1619 Project. This idea that we're going to teach young children to resent one another racially, teach them to obsess over the color of their skin in a society that's becoming increasingly pluralistic racially and ethnically. The fastest growing immigrant groups are Asians in this country. And the idea that we're going to teach third and fourth graders, put them in little social justice boot camps in elementary school and teach them to obsess over the color of their skin. I mean, gee, what could go wrong here? I find that very, very, very disturbing. And then, of course, there's the crime issue, where we're having these discussions about policing instead of having discussions about criminal behavior. I mean, just to give you an example, we in Chicago in 2019, so these are pre-pandemic figures, there were something like 492 homicides in Chicago, according to the Chicago Sun-Times. Three out of 492 involve police. So Chicago might have a policing problem, but it's clearly a secondary problem here as opposed to the crime problem. And yet you have a lot of intellectual elites and academics and media types spouting off on cable news and elsewhere about police being the biggest problem in these low-income minority communities. When actually the people who live there consistently tell pollsters that criminals are the problem, not police. They want more police. And yet you have a whole defund the police movement going on out there, an effort to reduce law enforcement resources. I mean, you mentioned Minneapolis. Last year, they had a referendum on defunding the police in Minneapolis. Not only was it overwhelming, soundly defeated, it was most unpopular in low-income minority communities that suffer the most violent crime. And those Blacks in Minneapolis are not alone. Around the country, poll after poll, decade after decade, have shown that crime control is a major issue for people who actually live in these communities. And to the extent that we start scapegoating cops for doing their job, frankly, we're going to get less effective policing. We're going to get cops who are more reluctant to get out of their cars, engage with pedestrians. They're going to pull back. And the result is that the criminals are going to have the run of the place, which is going to result in more dead bodies, many of them Blacks and Hispanics. So yes, I am quite pessimistic about where things are headed right now. And my hope is that the pendulum has swung too far to the other side, where you have, these local prosecutors now being elected by bragging about how few people they are going to prosecute. You see this in Philadelphia and Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, and I think even the average person is going, this is a bit much here. And so maybe we'll see a backlash, but for me, that couldn't happen soon enough.
So what does a Jason Riley research program look like for encouraging tolerance? If we have it all wrong with critical race theory and teaching students about race in third or fourth grade, what's the alternative for you? Do we just become tolerant just kind of through traditional education and not go overboard with some of this identity education that's going on? Or
well, we are. I mean, we have been becoming a more tolerant country. All the data points in this direction. Whether you ask people whether they, what kind of neighbors they're comfortable having, what kind of workmates they're comfortable having, what kind of classmates they're comfortable with their children having, all indications are moving in the right direction. If you look at something like intermarriage rates, and I don't know what could be a better measure of racial tolerance than intermarriage rates in this country. I mean, there's a multiple of what they used to be 30, 40, 50 years ago. So things have been moving in the right direction. The problem are the sort of, to use a dated term, the racial agitators out there. We have a civil rights movement that became a civil rights industry, if not a racket. And it has become quite lucrative to put forward racially divisive policies. It keeps activists relevant to the discussion. It helps them raise money. It helps certain politicians scare people to the polls. I mean, this whole debate we've been having over voting rights. This is a fake debate. If you look at the empirical data on Black voter participation rates in this country, they have been climbing steadily for some 30 years. In 2008 and in 2012, Black voter turnout in this country exceeded white voter turnout rates, even in states with the strictest voter ID laws in the Deep South and elsewhere. And those voter ID laws, by the way, are supported by an overwhelming majority of Black people. You'd never know that listening to the agitators, listening to the elites, the ones talking about defunding the police, the ones talking about how voter ID laws are disenfranchising Blacks. They're speaking for themselves. They're not speaking for the majority of Black people in this country. And so the problem here are the outlets that these folks have, the bullhorns that they have, to make it seem as though they are speaking for far more people than they're actually speaking for. And the media, my profession, does a wonderful job of indulging them in this. A police officer shoots a civilian. If the police officer is white and the civilian is Black, this is a major news story for 3 weeks. The press does not put it in perspective. It doesn't tell you how often this happens. It doesn't tell you if the Black person is far more likely to be shot by someone else who's Black than by a cop. It doesn't tell you if a cop is far more likely to be shot by a Black person than the reverse. No context, zero is put in place. Isolated, rare events are presented as everyday events that happen all the time. Every Black man is George Floyd. We all leave the house every day worrying about getting shot by a cop. Completely false, completely made up. No empirical data to support this. But you wouldn't know that listening to the media. So I know that's a long-winded answer, but my point is that racial tolerance in this country has been growing for decades. And it continues to grow, notwithstanding the racial agitators out there who right now are getting a lot of prominence, unfortunately.
So let's turn to crime. You talked about it a minute ago, and let me try to understand your story there a little bit better. So is the crime problem, how would you deal with the crime problem, I guess? Is your thesis that we need more policing? You've pointed that these defund the police efforts are taking us in the wrong direction. But
it's not my thesis.
Yeah,
this is what the people who live in these communities have consistently told pollsters. I can give you some hard data on this. A Gallup poll released in September of 2020, 81% of Black Americans said they wanted more police presence in their neighborhood or for the presence to stay the same. 80% said keep it the same or increase it. 2015 Gallup poll, after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, a majority of Black respondents said police treat them fairly. By a 2-to-1 margin over whites, Blacks said they wanted a greater police presence in their local community. That's 2015, after Ferguson goes down. And this goes back decades. A Gallup poll from the early 1990s, 82% of Black respondents said the criminal justice system doesn't treat criminals harshly enough. 75% said they wanted more cops on the streets. 75% of Blacks said they wanted more cops on the streets. 68% said build more prisons so that we can hand out longer sentences. These are the voices of the people who live in these communities. I mean, it's not a theory, it's not a thesis. It's simply asking these folks what they want. And yes, I think they're right, and I think they deserve better policing. And I think that people who are interested in addressing income inequality and racial inequality in this country should focus on crime control, because upward mobility does not occur in communities where bullets are flying around all day, coming through walls, disrupting birthday parties of 6-year-olds. Upward mobility doesn't occur in communities like that. What happens in those communities are that businesses flee them, the jobs follow, property values fall. I mean, there's this notion out there that poverty causes crime, but I think the truth is closer to the opposite of that, frankly. And so, yes, the people who live in these communities know that controlling crime is a big, big deal, something that needs to be addressed. The people who speak on their behalf to the press, the people who are supposedly representing their interest in Congress, they do not share these concerns because they have no incentive to. If you're a Black Lives Matter, if you're the NAACP, you want to talk about the cops. That's how you stay relevant. That's how you raise money. That's how you get elected if you're a politician. You blame the police. And so that's the problem that we have here. You have so-called Black spokesmen speaking on behalf of themselves instead of speaking on behalf of the people they claim to represent. And let me tell you, this is an issue that the person we were speaking about earlier, Thomas Sowell, pointed out many, many years ago. He was often asked in interviews, as I found during my research for the book, how does it feel to go against the grain of so many other Black people? And he would always correct the premise of the question. He would say, you don't mean I go against the grain of most Blacks. You mean I go against the grain of most Black elites. He says, and Black elites are no more representative of Black people than white elites are of white people. And that continues to be the case today, whether the issue is policing, whether the issue is school choice, which is overwhelmingly supported in the Black community, but opposed by Black elites, whether it's the voter ID laws that I mentioned earlier, whether it's affirmative action in higher education. Racial preferences in higher education are opposed by a majority of Black people in this country. And that has been true for a very, very long time. They are supported by Black elites. So this disconnect is something I think the media needs to take into account when it's reporting on these matters.
So is it fair to say that the Black crime problem has very little then to do with policing? And if that's what you're saying, what is driving the Black crime problem? We had Alice Marie Johnson in last semester, and her story was, yes, I did some dumb things, but then the punishment was extremely severe because she didn't have good legal support and advice on her case. How does that fit into the justice not being blind because you actually need money to actually do well in the legal system? So where is this Black crime problem coming from, I guess?
Well, I'm not saying that there are no racist cops. I'm not saying there are no cops who abuse their authority. Obviously, there are racist cops. Obviously, there are police who abuse their authority. The question is whether that explains these disparities we see in the criminal justice system. And I would argue that they do not, and don't even come close to explaining what we see. You could pass a law that prevented cops from shooting a Black person for any reason ever. It would not put a dent in the Black homicide rate in this country. It would not make a whit of difference in the Black homicide rate in this country because there simply aren't enough such instances of cops shooting Black people. They are so overwhelmed by non-cops shooting Black people and primarily by other Black people shooting one another. And that is what we don't talk about. We talk about the rare occurrences. 1 or 2% of Black homicides in this country result from or come at the hands of a police officer or a law enforcement official. Maybe 1 or 2% in a typical year. I gave you the statistics there in Chicago, but that is not typical. You'll find the same statistics in Oakland, in Detroit, in St. Louis, in Philadelphia. Like I said, Black men may leave the house every day worrying about getting shot, but not by a police officer. Yet that is what dominates our discussions here. Police reform. I'm all for making it easier to fire bad cops. I'm all for a better reporting from police departments of the use of lethal force. Let's do that. Let's do all of that. The question is whether that should be the focus of our discussion and whether doing that will make a difference. And I would argue that it would not make a difference. And that's clear to anyone who actually looks at the data. Black violent crime rates in this country are 7 to 10 times higher than white violent crime rates in this country. That is the fact of the matter. And again, most of that aggression is directed at other Blacks. And that is something we do not spend a lot of time talking about. That is what is too politically incorrect to discuss. And that's a problem. If you can't talk about what's really producing these results, how are we ever going to really address them? And unfortunately, we're still at a point where it's almost taboo to talk about these issues. Why is this happening? Well, first of all, there's a tendency to think that because this is the way the situation is today, it's how it's always been. That is not the case. If you go back to the first half of the 20th century, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, even the early 60s, you do not see these violent crime rates in these Black communities that we see today. And of course, this is a time period when Blacks were much, much poorer than they are today, on average. You did not see Black homicide rates in the 1940s and 50s, what you see today. In fact, in the 1940s, the Black homicide rate in this country fell by 18 percentage points. In the 1950s, it fell by another 21%. And what's remarkable about this era is that it was occurring at a time when the homicide rate among whites was relatively flat in the 40s and 50s, but B, it was occurring at a time when Blacks were migrating from rural areas into cities, both in the North and the South. And cities tend to be more violent than rural areas. So you would have expected the Black homicide rate and Black violent crime rate in general to be going up when in fact it was falling. So what was different about Black America in the first half of the 20th century? Well, one thing I would point to is more stable families. Black marriage rates in the first half of the 20th century were either equal or higher than white marriage rates in this country. As late as the 1960s, 2 out of 3 Black children were being raised in a home with a mother and a father. Today, more than 70% are not. And in some of our inner cities, it's as high as 80 or 90%. And I think a lot of the violent crime, the gang violence you see in cities like Chicago, are young Black men from fatherless homes who do not know what it means to be a man and are acting out. And that is what is going on here. I think broken homes are producing a lot of the violent crime in these communities. So that's what I would point to. Another thing I would point to is a poor education system. Let's put it this way: our jails and prisons are not full of college graduates. They're not even full of high school graduates, frankly. Simply completing high school can go a long way towards making sure someone doesn't have involvement with the criminal justice system in this country, or substance abuse, all teenage pregnancy, all manner of bad outcomes are associated with high school dropouts or people who do not complete the 12th grade in this country. And Blacks overwhelmingly attend our worst performing schools in this country. So I would also point to the education system, the public education system. And ironically, again, the people on the left who spend a lot of time obsessing over income inequality are also adamantly opposed to school choice, opposed to vouchers, opposed to charter schools that we know empirically have produced better outcomes with the same demographic groups in study after study after study. So that's what I would point to in terms of so-called root causes when it comes to the violent crime in this country. And again, it is not to say that racism is gone, doesn't exist, racist cops don't exist, or what have you. I'm just saying the factors I just mentioned, I think, play a far larger role than a rogue cop does.
One you didn't mention that I'm just curious about, and we're going to lighten things up in a couple of minutes and then turn it to Q&A as well, but maybe this is the last really meaty question here, but the war on drugs, where does that fit into our understanding of Black crime? You know, prohibition in the 1920s made a lot of white people really crazy and
Sure.
much more criminal. Where does that fit into your story about Black crime?
Well, I think that there are very good reasons to end the war on drugs, principled reasons, and the precedent of prohibition that you mentioned, I think, is a very strong. I think people can make a very strong case citing the example of prohibition. the question here is whether the war on drugs is driving the outcomes in the criminal justice system that we're all lamenting. And will ending the war on drugs, A, do anything about mass incarceration in this country, and B, do anything about racial disparities in our prison systems? And the answer to both of those questions is no. In other words, if you sent home everyone in prison who is there on a drug charge, the US would still have the largest prison population in the Western world. And if you send home everyone who is in prison on a drug charge, the racial disparities in our prison system would barely budge. Blacks are about 13% of the population. They're about 36, 37% of the prison population. Send home everyone who's there on a drug charge, Blacks are still right about 36 or 37% of the prison population. And the reason is because drug offenses are not driving the incarceration rate in this country. Violent offenses are driving the incarceration rate. The latest breakdown I've seen is from, it's pre-pandemic, 2018, 2019, something like 54% of people incarcerated in our state and local prison systems. And I'm using the state and local prison system because that is the system that incarcerates about 90% of people who are incarcerated. We have a separate federal system with a different racial makeup for different reasons, but the overwhelming majority of people incarcerated in this country is in the state and local system. And in that state and local system, about 53 or 54% there are there for violent offenses. Another 19% are there for property offenses, for theft. And then coming in third are people with drug offenses at around 15 or 16%. And only about 4 or 5% of them are there for possession. The rest are dealers. I mean, so it's not as if people are getting picked up with a dime bag and thrown into our prison system and serving lengthy terms. That's not happening. There's no room, frankly, for them. So in order to address both the mass incarceration issue, if you believe that's a problem, as many progressives do, and to address the racial disparity problem, what you would really need to do is release violent offenders from prison. That's what you would really need to do, or do something about the violent crime rate in this country. So again, I'm sort of agnostic on whether or not you want to end the drug war. I think there's a perfectly good reason to do it on principle. The question here is whether it will address the racial disparities we've been talking about. And based on the data I've seen, no, it won't.
Just a few quick questions for you, and then we'll see what the audience has on their minds. I can remember being an economist going home after I first had the tools of the economic way of thinking and talking to my mother about the minimum wage, and Mom, trust me, the minimum wage causes unemployment and it's really harmful for people it's trying to help. And I'm just wondering what family conversations are like for you, in terms of taking your ideas and taking them back home, and what kind of reaction and response you receive.
I don't get a lot of response. I mean, both of my parents are now deceased, but even when they were alive, we weren't a particularly political family. We didn't sit around the dinner table discussing these sorts of things when I was a kid. I didn't sort of get this, either the journalism bug or the political bug from anyone in my family. So I'm sort of the odd duck there, and we didn't spend a lot of time discussing it. So in terms of extended family, the people who are aware of my books and things like that, or the newspaper column, I generally get very good feedback. So it hasn't really been an issue.
And then, going full circle back to Sowell, he left a distinguished professor position, as did Friedman, to go to Hoover. Mm-hmm. You're at the Manhattan Institute and probably have a really nice setup with the Wall Street Journal too. You wrote something on NFL coaches just a couple of weeks ago. Can you describe your current setup and why people like Friedman, Sowell, yourself have chosen this institute route as opposed to just higher ed more generally?
Well, you'd get very, very different answers from all three people. I'll start with myself. I have no choice. I'm not an academic. I'm not a scholar. I'm not an intellectual. I have a bachelor's degree, and I'm a journalist. And so that's That's what I do. I write for newspapers. It's all I've ever done. So I write the books. I do public speaking, but my day job is as a journalist, and that's sort of I stick to my knitting there. I think Friedman had just had his fill of teaching and PhD students and office hours and the faculty lounge politics and all the rest. And after he won his Nobel in the 1970s, said, he got a kind of a cushy Sinecure offer from Hoover and said, why not? He had his fill of teaching. Sowell was a very different story. I think Sowell would have liked to go the route of Friedman, live out his days teaching, primarily, probably at a small school where you get to know the students and so forth. And he did that in the 1960s and 70s. But academia was changing during that period. You had a civil rights movement, you had a gay rights movement, you had a women's rights movement, and all of these, you had an anti-war movement, and all of these movements found platforms on university campuses, and the administrators really didn't know how to deal with this, how to handle it, and I think it all came to a head for Sowell in the late 1960s when he was at Cornell, and you had the student uprising, you had armed students taking over campus buildings and making demands to the administration, which promptly folded like a deck of cards. It was like a house of cards. He thought it was pathetic the way the administrators gave in to these student demands. And I think it really soured him on academia. And although he continued to teach in the 1970s, Amherst, Brandeis, eventually UCLA, I think he sort of had one foot out the door throughout most of the 70s, particularly second half of the 70s. And you have to remember, Sowell was born in 1930. So by 1960, he's already 30 years old. And he wanted to sort of teach the way he had been taught by people like Friedman and another Nobel laureate at Chicago. George Stigler was another mentor of his. And these were no-nonsense guys. They were hard graders, and Sowell brought that with him into the academy as a professor, and when he got to places like Cornell in the late 60s, it was, no, you can't be excused from class to go to an anti-war rally. No, we're not going to spend the whole class discussing the latest headlines in the newspaper. I'm here to teach economics. You're here to learn. I mean, it was a really, no, I'm not grading on the curve. It was a really no nonsense, and it didn't go over well in the faculty line. It didn't go over well with department heads. And he found himself running after running after running, as I described in the biography. And I don't think he really had the temperament to stick it out. And there has been a trade-off, to use the economist term here. If Tom had stuck it out in teaching, maybe we'd have hundreds and thousands of more people, graduate students, that he would have overseen their dissertations, and he would have had thousands of students, and maybe a lot more people out there thinking like Tom Sowell. Instead, he left. He went to Hoover, and we have the books and we have the columns, but we don't have Professor Sowell in the classroom. So there has been a trade-off, and I talked to people about that trade-off in the book. Personally, I wouldn't give anything for all those columns and books, so I'm sort of biased. But when he retired his column in 2016, I wrote that some people just lost the best professor they ever had, even if they never went to college, because Sowell had used those columns and those books to continue teaching, spreading that economic literacy, and again, I think he's quite proud of that work, and it's something he wouldn't have been able to do, or at least not as much of it, had he stayed in teaching.
That's great. So please hang with me here a minute, Jason. I'm going to see what kind of questions we have in the Q&A. It's open for anyone to add questions to. I believe there are some hybrid audience members upstairs who might come to the microphone and ask a question too. So let me dig in here and see what people are saying. So what would you say to the assertion that President Obama inherited the 2008 economic disaster of a deregulated housing and banking industry, and that he and Biden rescued the economy, which Trump then inherited? So essentially, long legs responsible for what you're interpreting in the data?
Sure. Well, the questioner is right. President Obama did inherit an extremely deep recession, not a normal recession by any means, extremely deep. But traditionally, the deeper the recession, the more robust the recovery. That has been the post-war trend. Instead, under Obama, we got the slowest economic recovery in the post-war period. That's what I'm getting at. And in fact, the economy that Trump inherited was not growing, it was slowing. In 2015, the second to last year of the Obama presidency, the economy grew at 3.1%. In 2016, the last year of the Obama presidency, that growth fell to 1.6% by nearly 50%, to the point where people like Larry Summers were predicting a 60% chance of a recession occurring. The Federal Reserve and the Congressional Budget Office were also predicting an economic slowdown that was coming for the Trump years. So Trump defied those expectations, and that's what I write about in the book. And to the extent that growth overall continued, I think you have to understand the difference in the growth in the Obama period and the difference in the growth in the Trump period. And to give you an example of that, for the bottom rung of workers in this country, the bottom income rung of workers, their wages grew in the first 3 years of the Trump presidency at more than double the rate than they had grown in the second term of Barack Obama. So we weren't just talking about the continuation of a trend here. We were talking about a tremendous acceleration of what had been happening under Barack Obama. And again, I think that Trump's policies, economic policies, particularly the tax cuts, bringing the corporate rate down, incentivizing businesses to bring money back from overseas to invest here domestically, had a tremendous impact on the growth we subsequently saw in the first 3 years of the Trump presidency prior to the pandemic. I think that the folks who want to give Obama credit for the Trump economic prosperity are sort of making a heads I win, tails you lose argument. In other words, if the economy had gone sideways in the first 3 years of the Trump administration, as they were predicting, I doubt they would have blamed Obama. But because it went well, they think Obama deserves the credit. And I don't think they can have it both ways, at least if they're being intellectually honest.
Looks like we have someone up at the Louise, John Bitson. I can see you just barely.
Okay.
How are you?
Good, really good. So I'm John Bitson. I'm the director of the Challey Institute, Jason, and thanks a lot for being here today. We really appreciate this. I can't tell you how excited I am that you're here talking to us, and I'm a huge fan of your column. I'm a subscriber to Wall Street Journal, read it all the time. So thank you. I just wanted, you've written some about how politicians oftentimes resort to identity politics rather than solving real issues, thinking about things like school choice that you mentioned. And so I'm wondering, as that becomes less effective, or do you have hopes that that's going to become less effective and maybe we can get away from identity politics and actually talk about real issues politicians can and as a society?
I'm hopeful. I'd like it to, but our current president just announced that a Black woman would be his next pick for the Supreme Court. That's about as blunt example of identity politics as you can get. And so he clearly thinks there's some more mileage to be gotten out of speaking this way and addressing the public this way. He didn't have to announce it. He could have just done it. But he wore it on his sleeve. This, Black people, I'm talking to you. This is what I'm going to do for you. You're going to get a Black woman, I want to hear it from you. And so this is, I think it's awful. I think particularly as the country becomes more racially and ethnically diverse, the idea that a major political party would want to continue down this sort of racial spoil system route to appeal to people, to make blunt appeals of identity, race, and ethnicity to people instead of appealing to them as Americans, I think is quite disturbing. And I think that's part of the problem I have with the critical race stuff I was talking about earlier. That's further down, that takes us further down this road. So that's one of the problems with the progressives being ascendant in the Democratic Party. I don't know that a Joe Biden of 20 years ago or even 10 years ago would have said something like that, or done something like that, frankly. But that's where what he's being urged to do today, and I think that's a problem. So while I'm hopeful, you know, I don't know how optimistic I could be. I will say this. There is a question of whether it's still working, because if you look at the president's approval rating among both Blacks and Hispanics, it's fallen quite remarkably during the first year of his presidency. And if you're a Democrat, it's fallen alarmingly, because you know you can only win, particularly national elections, but sometimes statewide elections, with 80 or 90% of the Black vote. And if that support is falling into the high 60s, you are toast. And that is where it has been in some of this polling for Joe Biden, despite his blunt racial appeals like the one I just described. So that makes me a little more optimistic. You know, maybe they're not getting the return on this sort of tactic that they used to.
So back to the virtual Q&A here, Jason. I had a question about campus actually as well. And there's a question here about what are your thoughts on NDSU faculty proposing that they are free to and should teach critical race theory at their discretion, and that no outside body should influence whether that topic or any other topic should be taught? Who should really control that decision? I had a more general one of what would you do to advance DEI on campuses today? You know, there was this study out about Ohio State University, and if you took their, I don't know, it was like something like 80 administrators who are all getting paid really nice salaries with something about diversity in the title for their position, and you scholarshiped students with it instead. It could be, I don't know, 1,400 scholarships or something at Ohio State. What can we do as a campus to try to just contribute positively in the area of diversity? And then that was my question. There was this critical race theory one as well.
Well, in terms of teaching critical race theory in higher education, that's nothing new. I don't know why it needs to stop happening. I mean, these kids in college, they want to take this stuff, they can take this stuff. I don't have a problem with these theories being discussed. I don't have a problem with Marx being discussed on campus either. I mean, this is, campuses are places where you're supposed to discuss this stuff openly, agree with it, disagree with it. But to say you can't discuss it, what is that? What are you even saying? What country is this again? I mean, it's just, now when it comes to K through 12 education, I think we're talking about something different when it comes to K through 12 education. So, but I would separate that from what we're teaching on college campuses. I think that should be up to, you know, people on college campuses and to the students who want to take it or don't want to take it. In terms of advancing diversity on campus, I guess I'd answer it this way. You know, when the University of California system ended racial preferences in college admissions back in 1996, after the state passed the ballot referendum that banned racial preferences in college admissions, Black and Hispanic enrollment and graduation rates in the University of California system went up. After racial preferences were banned, graduation rates in particular went up. So these policies that have been put in place to increase diversity, to increase the ranks of the Black middle class, to increase the number of Black professionals, had in practice resulted in fewer Black doctors and lawyers and engineers and social workers and so forth than we would have had in the absence of the policy. So it seems to me that if you want to increase diversity on campus, you should stop listening to the people who want to increase diversity on campus. The policies they seem to have put in place over the decades, and I would start with affirmative action, don't seem to be producing the results all of us would like to see. So stop doing things that result in less diversity on campus, I think would be my answer. And clearly affirmative action in higher education has been one of those things.
Thank you. Up in the Louise, we have someone, if you could introduce yourself too, please.
So, bonjour, Dean Bolli. Always a pleasure seeing you. It's me, Alexandre Cusa. Mr. Riley, I want to thank you for your remarks as well. I had just a couple questions. So I'm a NDSU alum, and I come from Rwanda. So I want to bring kind of a more global approach to what we were talking about. And I was thinking when you're referring to the criminality in the impoverished neighborhoods, I was thinking if you do some parallels when you look at Brazil with the favelas, if you look at townships in South Africa, if you look even at France, let's keep it also Western country, on how some neighborhoods, when there's a lack of opportunity, when there's kind of a general sense of impoverishment with people you live by, criminality, tends to go up. So I was thinking if even surpassing the American nation, trying to think on at the core, it's access, I think, to opportunity, access to a stable employment, and what you said as well, the educational system. The one thing when an observation I wanted to make is I tend to shy away from the statistics when it comes to, oh, there's more crimes of black on black versus black on white or cops on black, because when you think, once again, it's crime proximity. I come from countries where it's predominantly, let's say, black, whereas if you're in a wealthy neighborhood, for someone to leave an impoverished neighborhood, to go to a wealthy neighborhood and to kill a wealthy person, that's a lot. And you can bring back now the value of a body as well. A BIPOC body is less valuable than a white body. So you think if for a black criminal to go and kill someone in, let's say in Minneapolis, in Wayzata, that's a lot of risk. So I'm thinking, how can we surpass the, like you said, the race and really bring it back to access to opportunity? And I was thinking as well, the addiction, it's been seen, war on drugs versus epidemics, drug epidemic, like in North Dakota, the state where we live, there's been what we call a drug epidemic, which is beautiful because now there's resources to help people in need. Whereas when it's a war on drug, it's another approach. So I think addiction matters. And I was just wondering, coming back to, I love when you had the comparison of let's say World War II. So let's say the 40s and the 30s, how Black neighborhoods were very strong. Last year, we celebrated 100 years of the commemoration of the Tulsa massacre, when there was the Black Wall Street. Well, Black people were doing amazing. Everything was, I believe, doing pretty well. And then I'm pretty sure you know what happened. So to me, it's very complex, but at the end of the day, I think race is pretty core. But you're right, I love your term of being a race agitator. I'm not trying to do this, but I'm just thinking that elephant in the room cannot be ignored. And I was thinking, as it's very core to the American nation, I'm thinking if it's like an ally country like Germany that dealt with his troublesome past with the Holocaust, do you think, how can the US maybe not learn from Germany, but emulate a little bit Germany when it comes to actually addressing, instead of dancing around it or just putting it aside or trying to with a business as usual approach? That was my only reaction to this. And the last note was regarding drugs. The country of Portugal, I think, made now everything, I think, legal, or I think at least didn't criminalize it as much as they used to. And they've seen a drastic difference on the level of people criminalized and sent into the incarceration system. So again, some observation, some questions, but really, again, bring it back as well to the global level, where it's really not about black on black crime, it's just by proximity and also lack of opportunity. And how can we deal, like Germany did, for instance, with that core problem that race is in America? But again, without being, like you said, a race agitator, just thinking big picture. And foremost, for those to whom we have we owe it to, which is the future generation. Thank you, Mr. Riley.
Well, thank you for that. There's a lot there, but and I think I covered a lot of what you said in earlier remarks. In terms of why we talk about black on white crime, or white on black crime, or black on black crime, there is a side of this argument that obsesses over white on black crime as being the problem that blacks face. So it is important that you point out that most of the violent crime that blacks face comes at the hands of other whites. Moreover, when there is interracial crime, it is overwhelmingly black on white, not the reverse. And that is important to point out in these debates, because one side is pushing a narrative that blacks are being victimized by violent crime perpetrated by whites, that is a major source of violent crime against blacks, white cops or white civilians. The data does not support that. And it is necessary to point out that black on black crime is the overwhelming problem, because that is what the data shows. You went back to this notion of decriminalizing drugs and so forth. I don't know how much more thoroughly I can refute what the data shows, showing you the data on what is driving incarceration rates in this country, but it simply is not drug offenses. Drug offenses don't drive incarceration rate. You want to end the drug war, fine, but it's not going to do anything to address racial disparities in our criminal justice system, nor will it do anything to make us no longer the nation with the largest incarcerated population in the Western world. I just don't, the data is the data there. I do want to double down, though, on this argument you've made about a lack of opportunity and poverty driving crime among these communities. And again, we just have to we have to not only look at the data here, but be logical here. In the 1930s and 40s and 50s, there were much, much lower black crime rates in this country. And blacks were much, much poorer. If poverty is driving violent crime, why wasn't the reverse true? Blacks are richer today, and violent crime rates are higher. Is there less economic opportunity for blacks in 2022 than there were in 1960? Why were violent crime rates so much lower in black communities in 1960? In fact, just in 1960, black men were murdered at a rate of 45 per 100,000. By 1990, it had climbed to 140 per 100,000, an increase of more than 200%. Again, black people were much, much poorer and had many fewer opportunities in 1960 than they have today. So I take issue with your logic there. And in terms of learning lessons from Germany, my goodness, black people in America are the richest black people on this planet, which may be one reason they're not fleeing to Germany. I don't think Germany has a lot to teach America about race relations, about how to treat minorities, about any of those things. Again, the black economic advancement that has taken place in this country, based on where blacks started as slaves, to getting you to a Martin Luther King, to getting you to a Barack Obama. Historians have called the economic progress of blacks in this country unprecedented in the history, in recorded history. So I'm not picking on Germany. I don't think any country has anything to teach America about advancing racial and economic minorities in this country. We do it better than other countries do. We're not perfect, but we do a better job than most countries do. And I'd argue probably any country does. It does historically.
Thank you. Back to Zoom for a question about what do you think would be more effective? Adding police to cities and understanding that they usually show up after crimes are committed versus entrepreneurship education or trying to help inner city businesses launch. It's kind of a trade-off type of question. Guns, butter. Should we be?
Well, I don't think it's an either or situation. Again, you're not going to see upward mobility in violent neighborhoods. You're not going to see businesses moving into those communities, which is what you want to see until those communities feel safe for businesses to go in there and stay in there, and be able. And it's not that they're it's not because the business owners are racist. It's economics. It costs more to operate in a community where you're worried about shoplifting, where you have to spend a lot of money on security, and so forth. And so until there is, I think, a safe environment in these communities, you're not going to see these communities thrive. You're not going to see businesses move in. This is one of the reasons this sort of we've been watching these so-called smash and grab robberies all over the country. People running into drugstores and handbag stores and clothing stores and so forth, and running out. And in many of these places, they have decriminalized shoplifting, or they've made it a misdemeanor instead of a felony, even for repeat offenders. And what you've done by doing that is made it much more difficult for these stores to operate in these communities. So the stores leave these communities and the jobs go with them. And the people who live in those communities have to travel a further distance for fresh produce or medicine. You are not leaving these people better off by going soft on crime. Not to mention the fact, again, that the criminals tend to prey on their neighbors. So the whole effort to scapegoat cops or to let a discussion of policing suck up all the oxygen in the room here, I think is just a mistake. And it's not just wrong, I think it's dangerous in terms of the outcomes we ultimately see.
Thanks. Back up to Louise.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Riley. Thank you for speaking. My name is Amos Tarfa. I'm from Nigeria, but I've been here 15 years. So I'm a Nigerian-American chemist by background, but I love economics and I've studied some of your work and Dr. Sowell. My question partly has to do with being an immigrant who is involved in education and trying to raise up, scientists and mathematicians and so on. One of the challenges, as I've tried to speak to some of the issues you've shared about in the inner city and issues that the poverty facing Blacks, I've sometimes been told in a sense that I'm sort of disqualified because I don't have the same background or training and so on and so forth. And I really do want to help people of all backgrounds flourish. Part of my question is, how do you encourage someone who, and I grew up in poverty in northern Nigeria, you would say a different kind of poverty, but poverty and so on. And I want to make an impact, but have you, in this day and age, most times people want to say, well, you don't have the background and so on and so forth. What role can the immigrants play in a sense in that upward mobility in helping in the inner city? I hope my question makes sense, but that's something.
No, it makes perfect sense. And it's something that scholars like Sowell have tried to deal with. In other words, your experience undermines this whole racism as a blanket explanation for racial disparities in America. I mean, if it's about race, why do the Black immigrants come here and outperform, in many cases, not only Black Americans, but white Americans? And it's not just Black immigrants. This is true of the Japanese in America, who both outperform whites academically and economically and have for decades. It's true of the Chinese in Southeast Asia. It's true of the Lebanese in Ghana, in Ghana. And so it was true of Germans in Russia. It's Jews all over Europe and South America. It's example after example of an oppressed group, a hated group, a group that's banned from certain occupations, certain types of schools, owning land. Not only going on to rise to the level of the dominant group in that society, but surpassing the dominant group in that society. And Sowell's scholarship has gotten into this in detail and taking that international perspective. And there are a lot of Black Americans and Black American elites in particular who don't want to hear it. They because it undermines their narrative, which they cling to like a security blanket, that racism explains everything. It's racism. And you go, well, you know, is that racist saying, oh, you the Nigerian or you the West Indian, you're okay, but not the guy from Compton or the guy from the South Side of Chicago? I don't think the racists are that discriminating, frankly. And so I think what you're describing is something that needs to be known by more people, so that they don't buy into this racism as an all-purpose explanation narrative that is often put out there. So I hope you keep at it. I mean, there are people who just don't like the experience, comparing the Black experience to the immigrant experience in general. And I understand that. The Black experience is different from the immigrant experience, from the Asian experience, or the Irish experience, or the German. Obviously, there are differences, but it doesn't mean that we can learn nothing from the experiences of others, or that there aren't certain patterns that have been formed in groups that have risen, ethnic and racial minority groups that have risen from poverty to prosperity. So in addition to using the immigrant experience in my writing, I also point to, as I did in answering the earlier question, I point to the experience of Blacks of an earlier era. And that, I think, is a legitimate apples to apples comparison. And so people who want to blame Black outcomes today on the legacy of slavery or the legacy of Jim Crow have to explain why generations of Blacks much closer to the legacy to slavery, the institution, and who lived through Jim Crow were less violent, were making faster advancements economically and academically, both in absolute terms and relative to white outcomes, home ownership rates, entering the skilled profession. If the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow explains these gaps today, what explains what that earlier generation of Blacks was able to do when they had to face not only, you know, a sign in the window that said, we don't hire Blacks, or you can't go to school here, or you can't live in this neighborhood. They had to face that overt racism, legal racism. They also did not have a Barack Obama. They didn't have Black political clout that Blacks today have. They didn't have mayors of cities like Chicago and Los Angeles and Detroit and Cleveland, which Blacks had by the 1980s and 90s. They didn't have Black police chiefs and Black school superintendents. I mean, they didn't have the Black political clout that Blacks today have. And yet they were able to make these advances. And I think using the experience of both groups, Blacks of an earlier generation, as well as the immigrant experience, all undermines this use of racism as a blanket explanation for Black outcomes. So I think both are important. I hope you continue to make that case. I'm 100% behind you.
Just a few minutes left, Jason. One of our more popular questions that people are hoping you respond to goes back to the critical race theory comments you made much earlier. Do you have any evidence that it actually teaches children to resent one another? And is critical race theory even being taught in K-12 schools?
Well, people have different definitions of critical race theory. Do I believe that Richard Delgado and Kimberly Crenshaw's academic writings are being taught to third graders? No, I don't believe that is happening. But I do believe that the principles that Kimberly Crenshaw and Richard Delgado and Derek Bell and all the rest are very much incorporated into curriculums being put together like the 1619 Project. When you are teaching children that America is uniquely racist due to its slave past, when you are teaching children, when you are separating children by race in the classroom, Black kids over here, white kids over here, when you are telling, when you are segregating children in the classroom, yes, you are teaching racial resentment. You are teaching kids to obsess over their racial differences. And I think that is that can and will turn into a catastrophe if it continues. And I am entirely opposed to this being done. Not only because I think it's junk history that is being taught in the 1619 Project, but I just think it's bad for our nation to focus on such things, let alone teach them incorrectly. And that is what is going on right now in thousands, tens of, there are thousands of school districts in this country that have adopted the 1619 Project or related projects in one form or another that are inspired in large part by the critical race theorist that I named earlier, the teachings of Ibram Kendi, the teachings of Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is all of a piece with the racial propaganda that is little difference in substance to critical race theory, the purest forms of critical race theory. So I think this is a dodge that people are using. The bottom line is that our children are being taught racial propaganda at a very early age. They are being separated by the color of their skin in the year 2022 in America, and then indoctrinated with this nonsense. And I think it's horrific. And I'm waiting for more people to stand up and push back against it. And I think that might be happening. And I'm happy to see it.
So just a last question. Want to go back to Sowell for just one more time. So 2 questions on that. One, why don't you see more Black leaders embracing some of the arguments of a Sowell or yourself? And why is it so hard for other people to just kind of see your way of thinking? And then 2, something that surprised you in your research on Sowell that you just never expected. And we'll end it there.
Sure. Well, I go back to incentives in terms of why people think the way they do, why these organizations push the things they push. Incentives matter. And again, the Black politicians trying to get reelected been able to do so by telling Black constituents and others what the government can do for them. That Republicans want to steal their right to vote or take away their right to vote. Scare tactics like that, I think, have been effective. I think they've been aided and abetted by a Republican Party that's shown very little interest in going into these Black communities and asking for the vote. The Republicans typically write off this vote. They don't advertise on Black radio or Black Twitter or Black Facebook or what have you. They don't show up in these communities, go into the barbershops and ask for people's votes. They figure they can win without it. So it's a combination of things that I think have kept Blacks in general wedded to the Democratic Party. And like I said earlier, I think you are seeing some splintering there. But I don't think the Democrats are in any danger of losing a large portion of the Black vote anytime soon. And then you have an activist element here. This is how you raise money. If you're Black Lives Matter, if you're Black Lives Matter, if you're the NAACP, if you're the Congressional Black Caucus, it is always 1960 in America, and it's never going to change because that's how you raise money. that is how you stay relevant to these current debates. You are never going to acknowledge that the advances I've described here have taken place. It is not in your interest to do that. You have a vested interest in pretending it is still 1960 in America, and that is what you are going to do until it stops working. And right now, it continues to work. Finally, on Sowell, I'd been pretty close study of Sowell for a long time. I didn't come across a lot that surprised me. One thing that might surprise a lot of people is how late a start he got. This is a guy who was born in the Jim Crow South in 1930, North Carolina, orphaned as a child, never knew his father, who died before he was born. His mother died giving birth to a younger sibling He didn't know her either. A great aunt took him in, moved the family to Harlem when he was around 9, and that's where he was raised. Never graduated from high school. Left home on his own at the age of 17, was in the Marines, sort of got his act together. Didn't graduate from college until he was 28 years old. Didn't write his first book until he was 40. And he's written close to 40 books, 5 of them since turning 80. So pretty impressive personal journey that he's made. But again, what I think really distinguishes him is his courage and his honesty as an intellectual, someone who just simply puts truth above popularity and lets the chips fall. And I think we need more of that today, both in our journalism and in our journalists and in our academics. I think we need 100 more just like him.
Well, we're going to leave it there, and thank you for your truth above popularity this afternoon. We really appreciate you being our guest. Would love to get you. I don't know if North Dakota is on your list of states you have never been to yet, but we'd love to get you here at some point. And
I'd like that.
It's beautiful in the summertime, so we'll get you up here for eternal summer days. Thanks so much, Jason Riley, for being here, and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.